Welcome to part 3 of the lesson on phylogeny. In part 2, I introduced you to a type of evolutionary tree called a cladogram. So in this lesson, we'll briefly take a look at some other examples of different types of evolutionary trees. Then I'll talk about how we do hypothesis testing with phylogenetic trees. And lastly, how phylogenetic trees are constantly being revised based on new evidence. The most common type of evolutionary tree is made by doing comparisons of DNA or protein sequences. And in these trees, the length of the branch often indicates the number of changes that occurred. So in this tree, the length of these branches represents the number of nucleotide changes. So how many mutations occurred during the evolution of this lineage. You might also notice some numbers here at some of the branch points. These numbers indicate the degree of confidence that the evolution occurred in the way that it's represented here. So for this particular branching, there's a number 98 that indicates a very high confidence that these two groups split off from a common ancestor, as this tree shows. You can see if we go further back in time to a more distant common ancestor, this degree of confidence is lower. In some phylogenetic trees, the length of the branch can directly represent time. So in the previous tree, the length of the branch represented the number of nucleotide changes that occurred during the evolution of this group. But now we're looking at time. So you could be asked, say I asked you, let's look at these two groups of organisms. When did they split off from a common ancestor? The way you would do that is you would trace them back to when they last shared a common ancestor, and then go down to the x-axis, which represents the time, and read that time off the axis. And here I wanted to show you some additional ways in which phylogenetic trees can be created and visualized. So these 4 trees were all created using the same data set. All 4 show the relationships between different members of the daisy family, different flowers. Now in our course, you will mostly be looking at trees that look like either the ones at the bottom. But I also wanted to expose you to these other visualizations. The one in the top left corner is very common whenever scientists are looking at very large numbers of species. Now, when I first introduced you to phylogenetic trees in part 1 of this lesson, I told you that a phylogenetic tree is a visual hypothesis. Now, in science, a good hypothesis allows one to make testable predictions. So what kind of predictions can we make using a phylogenetic tree? We'll take a look at this one to give you an example. So this tree shows the phylogenetic relationship between crocodiles, birds, and various dinosaurs. Now, let's say we want to take a look at when crocodiles and birds last shared a common ancestor. So the way we do that is we trace them back to where they meet. So I'm going to take the line of birds and go all the way back to where this line meets dinosaurs. So over here at this point is where there was a common ancestor that gradually gave rise to both crocodiles and birds. Now you can see that this ancestor also gave rise to this variety of dinosaurs. Now, crocodiles and birds both build nests and they engage in brooding behavior. Brooding means basically sitting on the nests. Birds directly sit on the eggs. Crocodiles kind of rest their heads and necks on the eggs. Now, if nest building and brooding is a homology, then it should have existed in their common ancestor. So did this common ancestor build nests? That's our question. Well, if it did, then all the other descendants should have had nest building and brooding. So we would predict that dinosaurs engaged in nest building and brooding. So scientists made that prediction, and then they looked for evidence to either support or falsify it. When they looked at the fossil record, they actually found fossils of dinosaurs on nests. So we now know that nest building and brooding was a homology that was shared among all of these different species. So next, I'm going to ask you a question. I'd like you to write the answer down in your notes and also write down why you believe that's the correct answer. So which of these comparisons would likely yield the most accurate phylogeny? Comparing one morphological trait among different species, comparing multiple morphological traits among different species, comparing one gene sequence, or comparing multiple gene sequences, or comparing multiple gene sequences and multiple morphological traits. So which do you believe is the correct answer and why? So finally, I'd like to talk about how phylogenetic trees are constantly being revised as new evidence arises. And so we'll take a look at that using the tree of life. So basically all of life. So this tree was created a number of years ago using ribosomal RNA sequences. So all of life has ribosomal RNA. So that was a good category of genes to look at. And it shows the relationship among different bacteria, different archaea, and then here Eukarya, which includes us. But a more recent revision, here this study that was published in 2018, they looked at some additional sequences and especially focused on genes involved in metabolism. And they did a new revision of the tree of life where they placed Eukarya basically as a subgroup within the archaea. So they showed how most likely a particular branch of the archaea gradually gave rise to Eukarya. Now, this is not a crucial point for you to remember. What I want you to take away from this is that the more and more evidence we have, the more accurate our hypotheses about phylogeny will be. And then some additional evidence that has been further complicating our view of life is that we now realize that the tree of life is not so much a tree that has a single tree trunk that then branched out to increasingly more and more branches. Rather, it is more like a tangled tree. And actually, there was just a book published recently titled The Tangled Tree that examines the complicated evolution of life. So what we now know, as this simple diagram shows, this is highly simplified, is that throughout the history of life, there were numerous instances of what we refer to as horizontal gene transfer. So don't think of the branches of life constantly splitting off, but rather there have been numerous instances where two branches grew together to form yet a new form of life. And in a later lesson, we will focus on this part, which illustrates the horizontal gene transfer from bacteria into Eukarya. So now finally, let's summarize this lesson. So in this lesson, I showed you some examples of different types of evolutionary trees. So there's different ways to visualize evolutionary trees. Then we talked about how phylogenetic trees are hypotheses, and therefore they should be used to make testable predictions. And then finally, I showed you how there constantly are revisions to phylogenetic trees as new evidence arises. So that's it for today.